This is Richard Wolff, and I want to respond today, yet again, briefly, to this endlessly repeated notion that somehow the Chinese are snatching our intellectual property, stealing it, forcing it, and all the rest. I've commented on it before. I'm not going to repeat that, but I want to deal with it again here. And there are two reasons. Number one, trade wars have a nasty habit of becoming military wars, killing large numbers of people, and that's a tragedy we need to avoid. It's happened twice in the 20th century. World Wars I and II were heavily shaped by economic conflicts, trade wars, investment wars, and so on among the combatants in the war. That cannot be allowed to happen again. Much of the history since then has been an effort to do that. And it is simply moving in that direction to ratchet up the rhetoric around a trade war by claiming the other side is cheating, is stealing, and all the other childishnesses that pass for commentary these days. And the second reason I want to oppose it is there's more than a hint of racism here, some kind of idea that the Chinese people and the Chinese culture couldn't on its own develop science and technology and has to rely upon stealing from the West in general and the US in particular. That is really offensive material and should not be taken seriously. Let me explain. In the past, I have explained how and why most technology is transferred. People who know anything about technology and science know that it develops unevenly. This scientist makes a progress that another scientist takes longer to do. It develops quicker in this field than in that field, in this country rather than in that country. The conditions of scientific research vary. The inspiration governing the scientists in question varies, etc., etc. So it develops unevenly. Those parts of the country or the world that are not as advanced as others study what is coming out of the advanced part of the world. They read the journals. They go to the conferences. The purpose of the conferences and the journals is to disseminate knowledge and information, to make it available, to speed up everybody by having those that are not as quick learn from those that are. And most common thing you'll see is one scientist helping another and then being helped by that other because each of them has something to teach the other. That's the humane, that's the intelligent, that's the historical way science progresses. It is bad faith later on to come back and say that what was passed in the normal course of scientific diffusion was stolen by one side or the other. No one forced the American companies that went to China in the last 30 years, cutting deals to get access to Chinese cheap labor and to get access to the Chinese market, which is one of the fastest growing markets in the world. No one forced the American companies that wanted those things to go there. The deal the Chinese made with them is, where we are behind you technologically, that's something you can give us. And what we will give you in exchange is low-wage labor, very disciplined, and access to a rapidly growing market. American corporations made that deal because it was profitable for them to do so. Number one. Number two, the idea that the Chinese are not able to develop their own science and technology, well, that's based on ignorance. We actually have a good response. A very famous British scientist, one of the most famous in the history of the United Kingdom, a man named Joseph Needham, produced, starting I think it was in the 1960s or 70s, a multi-volume study, this British economist, of science and technology in China. It's a multi-volume work published by the Cambridge University Press. It was made a modern library books, 100 best nonfiction books of the 20th century. A major piece of work. And here's what it shows. The Chinese, far from being backward, have, over the last several thousand years, often been in the forefront They have developed science and technology which was way ahead of the West and which the West copied, which is what is normally done. In recent times, the Chinese economy was a quasi-colony. It never was a full colony, but after the Boxer Rebellion, particularly, before that in the 19th and afterwards in the 20th century, China was under the thumb of a number of Western countries, and its science and technology didn't keep up with some advances in the West, which they are now copying and learning from, just as the West learned from them. But to pick out one phase of this complex interaction that we have documented thanks to Joseph Needham and his colleagues who've produced this work, Science and Civilization in China, taking up much of the last half of the 20th century, it is clear that the implication that the Chinese have no experience at or don't know how to develop science and technology is not only bad faith, but is based on total ignorance. We are not going to win some technological race. That's not how it works. We're going to have to exchange. We're going to have to live to learn and learn together, because the alternative slows everybody down and is a one-way road to war and catastrophe. Shame on those who argue for that road, who take the cheap shot of calling thievery what has been a long tradition of scientific development, just as proudly accomplished in China as anywhere else. And this has nothing to do with endorsing the current Chinese regime or being without criticisms, neither of which come from us. But you have to call it what it is in the face of this crude, warlike level of accusations that are simply wrong.